Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Brenda McManus. She's working out of Trinity College in Dublin, part of the Dublin Dental University Hospital. She's an experimental officer in microbiology, and she's looking at bacteria that sounds like shouldn't be in foot ulcer infections, but yet they are. They're from another part of the body. So we're going to be talking about that and her work. So, Brenda, thanks for coming.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to you this evening.
Yeah. Well, if you would tell me, so in your own words, what's your research about?
Okay, well, I suppose in a nutshell, what our research is doing is looking to see if there can be a bit of an interplay between different diseases that might occur in one human host. So in particular, we're looking to see if the oral nasal cavity, so the mouth and the nose, can actually influence the health of other aspects of the body. And we know that actually there's a big link between oral health and systemic health, the health of the rest of the body. But we're looking at it, I suppose, me as a microbiologist, I'm kind of interested to see if the bacteria or the bugs that are living in the mouth or the nose can influence the health of other sites in the body. So the research that I'm leading at the moment is actually looking at people who have diabetes. Diabetes is a disease that happens if you have too much glucose sugar building up in your blood. Right. And this is because of a problem with a hormone known as insulin. So people who have diabetes tend to have either their body doesn't produce insulin anymore, or else they don't produce enough insulin, or the insulin that they produce is no longer effective. And this means that it's not able to process the glucose in the blood so in a way so that cells can actually use it for energy. So the problem is when that glucose builds up in the blood and the blood brings the high levels of glucose around the body, that can cause problems. But diabetes, I think we've all heard that it's becoming a real problem worldwide. I think there's about 10% of the global population now have diabetes, and a huge proportion of that actually don't even know that they have diabetes. It's undiagnosed. But the most common type of diabetes around now is type 2 diabetes. So that tends to happen later on in life, and it's when the body no longer produces enough insulin, or the insulin that it produces is no longer really effective. So because it's kind of a disease that can influence the blood and the sugars in the blood, it has the potential to cause a lot of damage in lots of other aspects of lots of other parts of the body. So, for example, it can have an effect on the nerve endings or the heart or the eyes or the kidneys. And another complication that tends to arise in people who have diabetes are diabetic foot ulcers.
Yeah, I've heard about those. So why does that happen from a traditional look, and then it sounds like you're looking at it from a different aspect?
Yeah, so they can kind of happen for a number of reasons. So diabetes, people with diabetes might have sort of poorer circulation than normal, or else they can have damage to their nerve endings, which means they might not feel extremities as well. So like if say a pressure wound was to build up on their foot, they mightn't be aware of it because of the nerve damage down there. Or sometimes if there was like a foot deformity or badly fitted shoes or whatever, again, a person with diabetes might not be aware of that as much, so they wouldn't get the pain before they develop the wound, So they're a little bit more prone to developing these foot ulcers. And also the healing times can be slower as well in this group. Sorry.
Yeah, I had heard that it was the microcirculation, I guess, the capillaries and all that in the foot and everything. They get, those vessels, I don't know, do they get blocked with sugar? Do they become atherosclerotic? Do they just die? What happens?
That's it, yeah. Sometimes you can get a lot of plaque building up in the arteries, and you can get a lot of atherosclerosis, which means, that the circulation, that can impact on the healing of the wound as well. So there's not as much, I suppose, immune cells getting to it or influencing the healing aspect of things. So when an ulcer develops in a patient with diabetes, they can be there for a really long time, and that can go on. So I think between sort of 15 and 20% of people who have diabetes can expect to develop a foot ulcer of some kind over the course of their lifetime. And
so how did you, I know this can eventually lead to amputations of limbs if it goes on long enough, right?
Yeah, it's a real problem because if you have a chronic foot ulcer and it becomes infected, then that really, really increases the risk of you ultimately needing to have a lower limb extremity amputation, which is obviously going to have massive consequences for a patient and their life subsequently, and their family and their carers as well. They can be really life-changing, as well as really expensive to the national healthcare budget. So
are diabetics encouraged to do visual inspection of their limbs and their body pretty often?
They really are, yeah. And generally they would have fairly regular appointments with diabetes nurses. And if they have a history as well of foot problems, they would, meet with the podiatrist as well to have checkups there as well. And those would include things like checking the pulses, so checking the circulation that's going down to the foot, as well as checking the nerve endings to see how much feeling is left in them as well. And then there'd be advice given about types of shoes and footwear to be wearing as well.
Okay, and then it sounds like you're saying oral health would have an impact on, the appearance and the progression of, for instance, diabetic foot ulcers. So tell me about how you came to that possible realization.
Okay, so obviously, I'm a microbiologist and I'm working in the Dublin Dental University Hospital, so I'm around dentists quite a lot of the time. And over the last 10 years, a lot of my research has focused on different types of diseases that affect the oral cavity. And over the last few years, I've been working on a type of disease called periodontal disease, or it's a type of gum disease. So this is a disease that affects the teeth and the gums. So periodontal disease is caused by the bacteria that can build up on the surface of the teeth in, dental plaque. And when the immune system responds to the bacteria that are on the surface of the teeth, you can get a lot of swelling and inflammation in the area surrounding the tooth. And that can cause the formation of these little pockets that are known as periodontal pockets within the gums. So, a sign of this might be, if your gums bleed when you're brushing them and they're quite red, and if they start to recede a little bit, so, your gums start to recede back from your teeth slightly. And if it progresses, it can ultimately start to be really, really destructive. You can start to lose a lot of the bone underneath the teeth that's supported and held in place, ultimately leading to tooth loss.
You know what's funny? I just thought of is, the Grimm's fairy tale of the wolf that ate the grandmother, and they say, "My, what big teeth you have."
Yeah,
I was imagining someone with periodontal disease.
And maybe
because their gums are receding.
Yeah.
The gums are receding. So you say, "My, what big teeth you have." But that's why.
So what's interesting is actually periodontal disease. It's fairly common. I think it probably affects nearly half of adults at some point during their life, but it's at least twice as common and often a lot more severe in people who have diabetes. And that's because the extra sugar that they have in their blood, and also they can sometimes have a reduced salivary flow. So it's fairly well established now that periodontal disease is a major problem in this group, and a lot more research more and more is beginning to show links between periodontal disease and other types of disorders in other parts of the world or body. So for example, now there are loads of different researchers now beginning to draw links between periodontal disease and cardiovascular disease and the buildup of plaques in the arteries, leading to heart attacks or strokes, kidney disease, arthritis, and then also even just neurological disorders are also becoming associated with periodontal disease, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And it seems that this seems to be part of the interplay between the inflammatory response as a role in taking part in periodontal disease rather than, the actual bacteria that are there. It seems to be a big interplay between the inflammation and the inflammatory response to the plaque and bacteria in the plaque.
Well, my dad, he's in his 70s and he's had diabetes for a while, and he'll go for, I guess, like a deep periodontal cleaning where they clean his gums out, every 3 or 6 months or so.
That's really good. That's really good.
Is there I would think there needs to be. Is there a whole branch of dentistry like called diabetic dentistry? Has that arrived yet or evolved?
It certainly hasn't in Ireland, not yet. I think there is some of the diabetes literature in Ireland would draw attention to, looking after your health and trying to prevent periodontal disease. But it probably isn't emphasized enough.
So what? I guess because in your mouth there's ready access to your bloodstream.
That's exactly.
I've heard that in atherosclerotic plaques, there'll be bacteria that shouldn't be there. They're supposed to be from the mouth, but they get into your vessels and, arteries and stuff because I guess they migrate. So are you thinking that there's a role in diabetic foot ulcers because bacteria from the mouth, right there near the bloodstream, they jump in, they go all the way down to the foot and then they cause problems?
That's one of the theories, yeah. So periodontal pockets are obviously, if your gums are bleeding when you're brushing them, then there's obviously a link or an opening into the bloodstream at that point. And some research has actually shown that in patients who have, gingivitis or periodontal disease, by brushing their teeth, they can actually detect oral bacteria in the blood 10 minutes after these patients have brushed their teeth. So it's been well shown that, something as non-invasive as brushing your teeth can introduce periodontal bacteria into the bloodstream. So what I have found in some of the previous research is that patients who have periodontal disease have a lot of staphylococcal bacteria in their mouths, and some particular types of staphylococcal bacteria in the periodontal pockets as well. And what's interesting is that staphylococcal bacteria are the most common cause of diabetic foot ulcer infections. So you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. We're looking to see if staphylococci in the gums and the mouth can actually be associated with diabetic foot ulcer infections. Now, it's possible that they could be introduced by entry into the bloodstream, like we just discussed, or it could be simple hand transfer as well.
You could do something that a paper that says gobsmacked by diabetic foot ulcers, the hidden tie between them or something.
That's a good one. Yeah, I've tried to do things with putting your foot in it, but it's kind of tricky.
Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah.
So you said brushing. I can imagine now if I brush my teeth and my gums bleed, which has happened sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm brushing any additional food particles and bacteria right there. Now there's an open access port for them to go into my bloodstream. So you said people have been tested 10 minutes after brushing and then there's bacteria in their bloodstream.
Yeah, that's been shown.
I guess then it's only a few more seconds or a minute or two before they get all over the body. And then they can, the bacteria are seeking food and they're in a new environment. So they're going to try to proliferate,
Yeah, but a lot of the time a healthy immune system would be able to manage that in the bloodstream quite easily. But the problem, one of the aspects of diabetes is that the immune system is challenged. So if patients with diabetes may be more prone towards developing a metastatic infection from the oral cavity if there's periodontal disease present.
Well, this would also look like a chronic infection because if I brush twice a day to my body, the rest of it, it's like, here they come again. Here they come again. So twice a day, every day, maybe all day long, or for a period of hours, I have like this chronic infection from these inbound pathogenic bacteria.
Well, it's quite a transient infection. It wouldn't be chronic because it would be cleaned up by your immune cells in your bloodstream. Yeah.
I just wonder what that challenge, that daily challenge does, not to just the mouth environment, but to the whole body. But like you said, when they're weakened by diabetes, then it's much worse.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And patients with diabetes can also have other problems as well, like cardiovascular disease is a big one as well. So another link between periodontal disease and heart attacks can also be the buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. And then in rare cases, endocarditis has been associated with streptococcal bacteria from the mouth as well.
If you like this podcast, Please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, how you specifically, like, what's your goal with the research? Are you trying to find the consequences of, I guess, a dysbiotic mouth microbiome on the rest of the body? Or, what's your particular focus in trying to understand?
Okay, so I suppose we're very much at the very beginning of this research, and while we would like to get to the comparative microbiome aspect of it, we're starting out with just staphylococcal species for the moment, because staphylococci are, the most common cause of superficial diabetic foot ulcer infections. So generally a foot ulcer infection will start caused by just one species, and most of the time that's Staphylococcus. But as a foot ulcer infection progresses, then you get other types of bacteria moving in, and the ulcer infection might become quite chronic and necrotic, and you get anaerobic bacteria moving in then as well. So but we've decided just to look at staphylococci for the moment. We can do direct comparison, so comparing the genomes of bacteria. So the genome being, the complete set of instructions for an organism. So the genome is made up of lots of different types of nucleotides, which are arranged into a specific sequence. And that sequence, or genomic sequence, is distinct for every individual organism on the planet. So what we're doing is we're taking swabs or samples from the mouth and from pockets and from the nose and from the finger and the toe skin and ulcers of patients who have diabetes and foot ulcers. And what we're doing then is we are looking at those samples, all the different samples from each participant, to see what types of species are present on each site, what types of staphylococcal species are present on each site, and then comparing them with each other. And then if we do start to recover the same species from multiple different sites of a patient, then we're going down to have a look at the genomes of the isolates that we've recovered from all of those different sites to see if they're exactly the same strain. And if they are exactly the same strain from each site in each patient, then that would be really, really strong evidence to say that there was transmission between the two different sites. So we put out a paper there earlier, just in April, that was showing fairly good supporting evidence that isolates of Staphylococcus aureus from multiple different sites of patients with diabetes were actually the same strain, which is giving us some conclusive evidence then that there's definitely a link between these different sites.
So the Staph aureus seems to first preferentially travel through the bloodstream to the foot, and when it's there, now it's in a unfamiliar environment, and it causes these foot ulcers.
Well, the natural carriage site that would be considered for Staphylococcus aureus would actually be the nose. About 30% of people carry Staphylococcus aureus in the nose all of the time, and then about another 30% will carry it, transiently or occasionally, not all the time, but it's there sometimes. So that would typically be considered something from the oronasal cavity rather than being on the foot.
I guess a possible confounder is that I've heard Staph aureus is also on people's skin in general. So when an ulcer first forms, perhaps the source of the Staph aureus is local to the ulcer. I don't know. It
could be, but that, in order to look at that, we also take swabs of the skin of the finger and the skin of the toe. So presumably then, if Staph aureus was typically resident on the skin of those people, then we would pick it up from their fingers or their toes as well. But what's interesting...
Have ulcers been characterized? People with diabetic ulcers, have they looked for ones where it progresses very quickly and strongly and ones where it doesn't? And maybe there's a correlation between, the Staph aureus load in their skin. I mean, I know there's only so much you can test, but has anyone looked at that?
They haven't really. I suppose there can be a bit of interplay between the types of organisms that are on the ulcer, but they can also be a lot to do with management and care. And because there's so many different comorbidities in patients with diabetes anyway, it can be kind of hard to stratify data like that. But what I would mention is that most of the research has only looked at Staphylococcus aureus in terms of diabetic foot ulcers, but there's actually another type of Staphylococcus species called Staphylococcus Epidermidis, and that's found on the skin everywhere in everyone. Like it's ubiquitous on human skin, and we found it quite commonly in diabetic foot ulcers as well. So what we've in our pilot research, which we published, we recovered Staph aureus from 6 out of 13 ulcers, and then in another 5 of those 13 it was Staphylococcus epidermidis. So I think that there's possibly a role for Staphylococcus epidermidis in these ulcers as well, but it's quite possible that Staph epidermidis could confer kind of a protective effect on the ulcers, so it might actually prevent an ulcer infection developing by being there, maybe by preventing Staph aureus from actually gaining access to it, because you never really see Staph aureus and Staph epidermidis together in one site. There seems to be an either or kind of a system between them.
Mm-hmm.
So Staphylococcus epidermidis doesn't seem to be as pathogenic as Staph aureus at all. It doesn't have the same amount of virulence factors. It's very much a commensal organism. It really just wants to be there and do its own thing. The only thing about Staphylococcus epidermidis is that it tends to have a lot more genes that encode antimicrobial resistance. So if you were to get an infection from Staphylococcus epidermidis, it's definitely less common, but they can be sometimes quite hard to treat because they like to produce a lot of biofilm, and it's kind of sticky kind of a substance that it can kind of put out around itself, which makes it much harder for antibiotics to penetrate into, and they have a lot more genes to kind of develop resistance towards these antibiotics as well. There's a little bit more to it, I think, than just the Staphylococcus aureus.
Well, I don't know much about ulcers. I mean, what is an ulcer and how do they form, first of all?
So an ulcer is really a type of wound that can form by repetitive injury, I suppose.
Oh, does it form from the inside out or the outside in? Like, have you looked at, pictures of brand new ulcers just starting to form and then like a longitudinal look on how they progress?
Well, I'm not a podiatrist and I haven't a huge amount of experience with foot ulcers myself, but I think they generally do form from the outside working in.
Yeah, the reason why I say it might be useful to look at them is then you can consider what's the microenvironment of an ulcer look like. And that may give clues on, okay, when the ulcer forms, is it first accessible to the outside air or is it first accessible to the interior of the body? And again, Initially there's probably 2 microenvironments before the thing, it's gross, but I guess pops open and there's interplay between the in and the out. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, I think the environment of an ulcer can definitely change over time depending on how it progresses. So, if it deepens, then obviously it's going to be quite a different site to one that's more superficial.
So you think there's, at least at first glance, a competition between Staph aureus and Staph epidermidis? And is it that in an ulcer, the Staph aureus starts to win and excludes and pushes out the Staph epidermidis? I'm
not quite sure, because we tend to see a lot of Staphylococcus epidermidis in periodontal pockets, and they are a diseased site. But so it could be considered that maybe Staphylococcus epidermidis plays some kind of a role in the biofilm in a periodontal pocket site, but maybe not necessarily contributing to the disease as such, but just being present. In the diabetic foot ulcers, generally it'll be either Staph aureus that's there or Staph epidermidis that's there. But so far we haven't seen any real correlation between, Staph epidermidis is there, there's no clinical signs of infection. Staph aureus is there are clinical signs of infection. At the moment, it's really not that clear cut. Yeah, that's why you're saying the picture's muddied so far. Yeah. So what's going to be, like, what do you imagine the progression of your research might be? What are you figuring out now? So, okay, there is Staph aureus there, at least in some cases, and then you're going to genotype it or look at the sequence to make sure, and then what? Like, what do you want to continue to prove? What's the line of thinking? So so many different ones. The next one I would be interested to look in is if the Staph aureus in the mouth or the nose and the ulcers are exactly the same strain, and we continue to find that, then is it potentially moving through the bloodstream, or is it potentially being transferred by the hands? So I guess then, I would love to start to do kind of model looking at doing a blood draw on a patient, say 10 minutes after they've brushed their teeth or undergone periodontal debridement therapy, and see if we could recover Staphylococcus aureus from the bloodstream of those patients and see if they were identical, to potentially, I suppose, to draw a more conclusive chain of transmission, as it were, or else to maybe start to look at more finger sites or whatever to see if it could be just a hand to nose or a hand to foot kind of contamination issue or transmission that way. Another one that I'd really like to look at is comparing the microbiome between the two sites, because if you could detect the same strains of staphylococcal species at both sites, well, are there other types of bacteria that are in common between the two sites as well? Because they can actually, they are comparable sites. They're both wounds. Periodontal pocket is a wound in the gums.
You mentioned you're trying to establish if they're the exact same, but I know that bacteria have their own phagome, all the phages associated with them, and phages can transmit plasmids, and the bacteria can transmit plasmids between each other. They may not be the same, the staph aureus in the mouth and the staph aureus, let's say, in a diabetic foot ulcer. But if they're only changed slightly or in a certain way, perhaps then you could establish, yes, they are the same thing, but the staph aureus that made it to the foot, it's now in a different, microenvironment, and therefore it may have changed in this predictable way, but it's still the same thing. It came from this parent strain, essentially, that was, 5 feet away in the mouth.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're not looking at the plasmids of the bacterial isolate pairs, I suppose. We're looking at the entire genome, which includes the entire core genome, as well as an accessory genome, which would contain those kind of mobile genetic elements there that you're talking about. And we compare all of that together. So you're talking about over 2,000 different loci or, areas of the genome that we compare to each other. When I talk about isolates being identical, then they are the maximum amount of differences that I found between isolates at different sites are 6. So it's very, very, very small. So it's, they're nearly suggestive of microevolutions that might occur in that one strain over a period of time, rather than, it's much tighter. The strains are much more related than them having evolved they are identical.
When you figure out where these staph aureus are coming from, then what? Are you going to try to help diabetics prevent foot ulcers, or is one path possibly to tie it back to oral health, and therefore if you had better oral health you wouldn't have these ulcers? If
we are able to show how important periodontal health and care is in the prevention of diabetic foot ulcers, as well as periodontal health improves diabetes health in general. Like, research has shown that if you carry out periodontal therapy on patients with diabetes, that can actually improve their glycemic index and their glycemic control. So there's loads of different reasons for improving the oral health education and informing patients with diabetes to actually look after their gums as much as possible and go and see their dentist twice a year or their hygienist. Aside from the other benefits, if we can improve periodontal health in patients who have diabetes, that might potentially be able to reduce the risk of developing an infection of a diabetic foot ulcer, which would have hopefully much better outcomes and prevent a lot of lower limb extremity amputations. So I think there needs to be probably more emphasis put on the importance of periodontal care in diabetes care.
It needs to be the McManus protocol for diabetic dentistry that's licensed worldwide to help people with better health that have diabetes. Yeah, that's what needs to happen.
One thing that we did see in the pilot research was actually it was quite hard to recruit people for it, because a lot of the patients that we saw actually had no natural teeth left, which I think is fairly supporting, is giving us fairly supportive evidence that periodontal disease in this group is a really big problem.
So they literally had no natural teeth left?
Yeah. And if you've no teeth, then you have no periodontal pockets. So they although they wanted to be involved in the project, they they couldn't because they had no pockets to be sampled. So it's
So I know this is getting into weird areas, but someone that has no natural teeth, like what their gums become monolithic, and do they have to brush anymore? I mean, I would think they still have to take care of their mouth, you know?
Yeah, well, they would have dentures, so they'd need to be maintained as well.
But in addition to the denture, you take your dentures out. I mean, I don't know if you probably have anchors, maybe that go through the gum.
Yeah.
You know, so the anchors might act like teeth in a way, and they might form pockets around them.
Yeah, you could still get a lot of biofilm building on around dentures, and yeah. So there does need to be an oral maintenance or an oral hygiene routine, no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, very interesting. Weird. I don't know. I guess like you, dentistry is very interesting to me for some reason. So I've spoken to quite a few dental people, and I know there's books out now on oral microbiome health. So it's growing and growing in importance.
Yeah, but the mouth is actually a really fascinating ecosystem because there's so many different types of surfaces and so many different processes that go on in there when you think about, you're producing saliva, and then there's the motion of your tongue, and then there's so many different surfaces like the tongue and the palate and enamel and gums. And if you think about it, the air that you breathe, the water you drink, the food that you eat, it all comes in through your mouth. So it makes complete sense to me that the mouth and the oral cavity would have a massive impact on your overall health. Yeah,
no, definitely. So Brenda, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and keep tabs on it?
I'm on ResearchGate and LinkedIn and Twitter, the usual places. And we actually have a diabetes page or a Twitter's handle called Diabetes Ireland that we've set up just so if anybody's interested and wants to track our research, we put up posts and stuff there about, promoting periodontal health and talking about diabetic foot ulcers, and also talking a little bit about the team and what we're doing as well. So you could check us out on that if you're interested in hearing a little bit more.
Okay. Well, very good. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks very much, Richard. Nice to talk to you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.